On today's episode, we'll be discussing the topic and the idea of political realism, what it is, and as well how it is practiced and applied in the world of politics and governance. As always, he's Jordan, I'm Braden. Together, we are the Realist Idealists, and this is Powerview. So, of course, for starters, what is political realism? The Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines political realism as political realism is the theory of political philosophy that attempts to explain, model, and prescribe political relations. It takes as its assumption that power is, or ought to be, the primary end of political action, whether in the domestic or international arena. When we say political realism, it is inherently focused on the philosophy of power being the ultimate objective of individual political motivation and action. Power in this sense is in the form of holding political office and influence. This essentially means that in politics and international relations, every decision that people in those positions have to make should be done with the ultimate goal of obtaining more power, whether in the form of hard or soft power.
And this can be taken a step further with the foundations of neoliberalism. In neoliberalism, power is seen as the most important factor in politics. It's important to acknowledge that neoliberalism is the most common political philosophy that we see used by politicians to analyze and examine international relations today. Simply put, those with power to do so get their way, and those without don't. In particular, Kenneth Waltz, the political scientist who coined the term neorealism, focused on how our structures in international politics promote and reinforce the notion that power is the be-all and end-all in politics. It is the idea that the global arena of international politics, nations need to be self-reliant. Neorealism can also be broken down into two major schools of thought: defensive realists and offensive realists. Basically, in simple terms, what it comes down to is defensive realists believe that all states seek to achieve a sense of security rather than ultimate power, and offensive realists believe that states are just trying to maximize their power over other nations rather than for stability. This is key to our understanding, as is the justification of why our governments and individuals make the decisions that they make. So how does political realism impact our political systems?
In any decision, the end result is not the only thing we need to look at. It is arguably more important to ask ourselves why that decision was made in the first place. Asking ourselves, was the decision made for political reasons, or was it simply good governance? So, we're going to take a look at some examples here and kind of play out some hypotheticals and see how actions may be justified, right? In particularly, I think we're going to try to focus ourselves with a political realist lens, right? But in kind of extrapolating, I guess, the examples, there's a chance that we're going to kind of show both the positives and negatives that can maybe come out of a decision-making process within politics, right? So, Jordan, I guess the first one that we have here is the idea of when governments decide to build a bridge, right? So let's say you're building a bridge. Let's say it's actually even more than just like over a little like stream type of thing. It's going from like one municipality.
It's connecting
to the
major
next.
like metropolitan centers. Yeah.
So, let's talk about that, right? How does that kind of play out, if that makes sense,
in terms of the realism? Okay, so
so if let's say a bridge is getting built, right? It's passed through like the local municipality has decided to fund this bridge, right? And I guess from a surface level, you look at that and you're saying, hey, we've now connected two populations, to
So,
municipalities, to whatever, right?
yeah, or reduce the travel time and all that stuff. Yeah,
Yeah. Instead of taking a ferry, now you have a bridge that you
a
can drive
bridge. Yeah,
across,
yeah.
right? Obviously, at face value, something like that seems great, but maybe I don't know if you want to speak to like how, knowing that we have political realism, right? It's arguably one of the more popular tools that I think politicians use in terms of a philosophy for when they're doing business. What would maybe be some of the other reasons or rationales for
Motivations. Yeah.
why they were building that
We
bridge?
were actually just not too long before this because we were talking about like certain motivations and stuff, and
Yeah.
depending on the situation, like you said, if it was like, I mean, it could be any level of government that offered to sponsor it. Actually, could be
Yep.
doing it
Yeah.
for something like votes, right?
Yeah.
Even though
Definitely.
maybe that building a tunnel might be the more, like, if you looked it out, right? Like maybe it's because the idea of a bridge was floated by the general population, that, and someone then tried to capitalize on that for their own gain, in a sense, where
Yeah.
maybe if you stood back and look at the situation and go, hey, well, we should connect them, but maybe there's another way of doing this. Like, should we build a train rail instead, or like maybe go a tunnel under the water is maybe safer, like,
Mm-hmm.
so it's, yeah, there's always,
Yep.
you gotta look at the motivations as to why,
Yeah.
I think. And if
Yeah.
like, and in some cases, like, just because it's not coming from private funding doesn't mean that the intentions are like necessarily good, I guess. Because we get the idea,
Yep.
oh, if the money is being publicly funded, it's being spent with the best interests of people at heart, but we don't always know that that's the case.
Yeah. I think you kind of hit it right there, even just in general with the whole asking your motivation, right? Um, I think it's always great for any, and you're going to see this as we go through all of our different examples, right? But
Yeah.
so it's going to be a common theme. But asking yourself in any political decision, especially, but you could maybe extrapolate this to other parts of your life. Who benefits from that decision, right?
Decision.
So
Yeah.
obviously, Jordan, you brought up this idea of, hey, maybe it's popular with the voters, so it's going to get me votes and get reelected in a democracy, right?
Yeah.
Definitely, I think that's a huge thing. Maybe it's even the aspect of,
Well, I was
well,
going to
let's
say,
say,
because,
yeah,
sorry, I just, now it came into my head because, my parents live in Oakville, and there's a lot of development happening in places where it's not the greatest idea, and there's still plenty other good spaces, but somebody's getting probably a kickback from the developers for doing that, right?
yeah,
So it
yep,
looks like, yeah, we're building homes, but it's like you're not building the best homes possible in the best locale possible, or at least in a way to make it work where everybody has the same, like, the traffic's not going to be then as soon as those houses open up, all the roads are congested. Like, you know what I mean?
yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like that's potentially going on to a separate example, but I think to your point, this idea of like land zoning, right? Deciding where are we going to develop, right?
Yeah.
I know that that's a big conversation right now in Ontario as a whole, right? With the opening of the green belt, right?
Yeah.
Um, which is obviously used to be a protected like region of green space that is now our provincial government has now opened up for development, which obviously that's great when it comes to like Ontario or Southern Ontario is one of the poor. Um,
Well, we in
uh,
general, Canada's got a
uh,
massive housing shortage in general. So,
yeah, I
like,
wouldn't say it's not Canada. It's really it's Southern Ontario. It's Southern BC.
yeah,
And
and
you can
like,
maybe make the argument that it stops there, but I would say also like Montreal
yeah, some certain
is
spots, yeah, that you're
pretty
like, that's
rough
a lot
because
of
you
money
can't really
for,
build out.
yeah, a basement that's gonna flood.
Yeah, yeah.
It's gonna flood. So.
So as a whole, right? It's not really a Canada issue. in its entirety. But for Southern Ontario, right, in particular, where most of Ontario lives, you could argue most of the country lives. um, uh, we have obviously a huge housing shortage, right, relative to the houses that are on the market for people to actually purchase, right? So obviously adding more houses into the market is a great thing. But asking yourself, okay, well, so who owns that land, right? Who's developing that land? Who, what types of houses are they going to be building in that area,
and like
right?
also too, like
What
which
businesses?
municipalities do they incorporate?
Yeah, right.
Because
So
again, like you said, to your point, like we live in a big country, so like it's nice to develop houses, but like, are they going to have access to stuff? Are they going to, you know what I mean? Or do you have to build the infrastructure there now to support it?
yeah, I think that though that side of that question is more of like a logistical question where it's like, does
Yeah,
that spot make sense? Like you talked about it earlier, this idea like, oh, if you chose to like develop in this area, but it's in a flood region, right? Like or
yeah,
flooding plain or whatever the terminology is for that. But I think it's in terms of our kind of political realist lens, right? With this emphasis on power, right? Power
yeah.
is ultimately a large focus when it comes to political realism, right? Whether that power is used for offensive reasons or more defensive reasons is kind of neither here nor there. It's still centralized that like, hey, I need to gain
It's
power.
doing it to consolidate power. Yeah,
Yeah, kind of as we've talked about it in
yeah,
like the previous episode, this idea of power and control, right?
yeah.
So I think when it comes to if we're kind of going to focus here on like the land zoning stuff, it's asking ourselves again, who's going to benefit from those land zonings, right? So I think that great points, right? Like which municipalities are those is the green belt located within, right?
Or whatever is
So
included. Yeah,
it's going to mean that there is more taxpayers that are going to be in those areas, right? Maybe maybe there was just like an automatic kickback that the municipalities were given by the province. I don't know that that's actually the case, but I'm just saying hypothetically, right? Maybe you're asking yourself, okay, which builders are going to get the contracts to be able to build in those areas, both from the infrastructure standpoint, right, all the way up to the actual physical buildings and housing and all that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
You can make the argument of how does that change in terms of well, going back to votes, right? Maybe you're putting more of a certain people
Emphasis,
into an area where maybe you're kind of keeping the votes the same, right? Like it's just going to be more people that tend to vote in that same situation are going to move into that area, or maybe you're like, hey, maybe this will be a way for us to kind of curb that. Like, I don't know. Let's say you're going to go for like government housing in an area, and then you could make the argument that maybe people that are going to be accessing government housing are going to be a little bit more liberal, NDP oriented, right? Like that want that like kind of social welfare state. Maybe that's kind of the way that you're trying to like emphasize with the voting side of things, right? Like there's all different layers to it.
levels.
Yeah, but it's important to kind of ask those questions because that really is what
kind of drives the whole.
Yeah, because the surface level of any of these decisions is right.
Well,
if we're going to go with the land zoning,
because there's as we were talking about that just before, is like the dam in China, and I think it's the Three Gorges Dam, but it's like it's displaced so much water that like the Cambodian river system's now affected by it, and the Vietnamese part of it, because I think it flows out of China and then out into those countries and then out to sea from there.
Yeah, I mean, we were not talking about the dam necessarily in this episode, so you might have to give some context for all that.
Sorry, no, we were talking. Sorry, we were talking about earlier. Well, you and I were because you sent me a video on it a couple days ago.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
And then I was thinking about that. I was like, yeah, because downriver it's affected them, and realistically, yes, China's trying to provide power to their people, but what was their motivation for doing it? Because they also have more coal plants than any other country on Earth as well. So like generating power is not hard for them to do. Why did they choose to do it there and like make such a big statement, right?
Especially, I think, in hindsight, when you see the results of that dam, right?
Yeah, a lot of it, like animals are starting to become endangered. People were displaced.
Well, I was going to say, because it's literally slowed down the flow of that river
Yeah,
to the
and
point that it's dried up like waterbeds
yeah,
in neighboring countries. So it's not necessarily even affecting their own country,
directly
right?
it is,
And
but it's
again,
even yeah,
it's not to say that these I don't know that there's some nefarious reasons for this.
yeah. I would hope. I like to not to think so, but yeah,
Yeah, but you do have to ask yourself, um, if you're an observer of certain things, right? Like, so the dam, the bridge situation, land zoning, right? All three
yeah,
examples that we've just kind of thrown out there right now. When you're an observer of it, you have to ask yourself, okay, what's the end result? Plus, who kind of benefited from that? And were was the decision ultimately kind of, well, going back to this idea of like politics versus governance, right?
yeah.
Was it kind of good governance in the sense that like it was for the good of the people, it's the good of the
For the
nation or
greater
whatever,
good
right?
kind of thing. Yeah,
Yeah, we're solving a problem, or maybe that was the case, or maybe it wasn't the case, but was it more about kind of greasing the palms of politics, right? Like in the sense
mm-hmm.
of did I gain way more on a personal level, um and that was ultimately my motivation, right?
Yeah.
um because that's really the importance, especially, I think, you've technically lost your camera, so
Oh, let me turn
maybe
it off
that
again.
will be a problem, but it's all good. I'm gonna keep rolling with
Yeah,
this. It's especially important, I think, and the reason why we're even talking about political realism in particular is that in countries that have democracies, it's very easy to look at the surface level of a decision and say, hey, maybe this benefited me, so now I'm going to vote for it, right? I feel like the voting
yes, yeah.
conversation is a huge one, right?
Well, yeah, the bridge just saved me 45 minutes to work.
Yeah, or
Like, so,
maybe I own the, I don't know. Let's say there's a logging camp that's on the other side, like on the island,
yeah,
and there's
yeah,
a bridge that like is now connected to it. So it now makes my business, or it's a coal mine, or it's a whatever, right?
yeah,
I'm now able to get my goods off of that island a lot quicker, right?
yeah.
Or anything like that, right?
Well,
Like
yeah, even like
it's
business interests, right? Because like, yeah, if you know you're gonna have like you just said, it's like, oh, this company is now gonna have more trade coming in and out, so they're more
yeah,
likely. Like, you've got the votes of that whole.
yeah,
Hey, you
yeah.
guys are the ones building the bridge, all right? Like, yeah,
Hmm. And there's nothing to be said that those things don't indirectly happen, right?
yeah,
I think a good case in point, if we're going to use, I originally said at the beginning of this episode, before we were even on air, um, to Jordan, that we will try to stick to, as much as possible, not using actual real world examples, just kind of give the like loose space examples that still could apply to the real world.
world,
But I
yeah,
think like a good case in point, one that's probably talked about quite a bit. I know if we haven't already, Jordan and I will definitely talk about it on other episodes. But when Justin Trudeau, our prime minister, first got elected, his kind of, I feel like the main thing that probably got him into power was legalizing cannabis, right? So in
correct,
Canada,
yeah.
marijuana is
Yeah,
legal.
is the highest
Um,
voter turnout of 18-year-olds in history.
yeah, right. So you could make the argument pretty easily that that was the kind of low hanging fruit, that he did that to get the votes, right? you could also make the argument, which is a fair argument, that actually was potentially the right thing to do, that legalizing it did serve the best for society, right? That to punish people for the for cannabis in that way, and
the intentions were good,
the kind of war on drugs aspect, and all those other kind of conversations that go along with that, you could make the argument that him doing that was the right thing to do. But it would be naive to not realize the democratic voting benefit that you get
that
from
brings, correct? Because
right,
we
it's like raising the minimum wage, right?
Yes,
like
you're going to get everyone that's 18.
You're going to get tons of people that want to do that, right? You're also going to get some people that don't want to do that. No different than the like cannabis, no different than building a bridge, is no different than whatever, right? Like there's always going to be opposition to any decision. Otherwise, we would just live in some harmonious world where everyone gets along.
Like, he was just because the way they've set up to dispense cannabis here has been a nightmare since day one. I mean,
because they legalized it and said, "All right, I'm like cleaning my hands,
washing my hands of it."
Right, everyone else figure it out, right?
We all work with someone like that. Yeah. Hey, I brought it in, so I'm done.
Yeah. Why? Why?
Now I got to carry all that stuff inside.
Yeah. You're like, thanks. But yeah, it is. I forget what I was going to say there. I think all in all, just that idea of, is that scenario truly honest with what?
Because like you said, and sometimes like the benefits are still good enough for everybody else, but the fact the way it's done, that it's presented in a certain way, but the motivations are different.
Yes, because the end result is kind of like, that's black and white, right? If you built a bridge, you built a bridge, but who financially benefited from it? Who politically benefited from it? Who, even just simply the aspect of, like, if you're going back to the bridge example, right? Let's say it's a bridge, obviously, like over water. So maybe hypothetically there was already a ferry system in place, right? So you could spend some money and maybe, I don't know, build another couple ferries, right?
Yeah.
Which would, I don't know, let's just say argue like that it would do a reasonable job to allow traffic to kind of move back and forth, right? But building the bridge, not only does it kind of ease of access, right, like that benefit, but you could make the argument that maybe employment is a little bit low and we need a lot of people to get a job. Building a bridge, a whole new infrastructure, a whole new infrastructure being built is it's huge. It creates jobs, it creates more taxes, it creates more like money within the system, right? So that's why a lot of times, from a general aspect,
there's motivation because most bridges in the States are tolled.
Sure. So that can have tax benefits,
revenues for the state.
But even just in a general sense, a lot of governments spend money on like public works, right, infrastructure and stuff like that, because they ultimately know that, one, obviously there's the benefit from the actual physical infrastructure being put in place. But when you have more people working, that's more money that they are able to put into the economy, right? And that is a benefit overall, always, right? Like, if it is earned income that you're not getting it from a handout, you're kind of putting in your labor and you're doing it, that is always going to be a benefit, because you then are going to go and buy whatever, and then the owner of the store that you bought that stuff from is then going to have more money that they're going to then buy some other stuff, right? Like, and the cycle just kind of continues from there, right? And that's super important for the health and growth of economies, right? Like, so Again, you could make the argument, right? So we've been kind of talking about political realism. I feel like probably a lot of people are going to get the sense that it's like, oh, this is like the bad stuff with decisions are all political realism.
Yeah.
I don't want
Yeah.
that to be the case, because the example that I just gave right now with this idea of you could earn more taxes or earn more like income within the economy, you could make the argument that something like that is more of like a defensive realism standpoint, right? Where it's like, I want to build up my economy to just kind of protect us from any changes in the global market, let's just say,
Yes.
right?
Supply chain issues, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So it's still for the gaining of power, but there's still maybe an essence of an us versus them mentality, but
yes, yeah,
it's not as much of a me mentality, if that makes sense.
Yes, it's more
right?
of a I'm trying to think of the word for it, but it's more of like a preservation, like a thought of preservation, I guess, than anything else.
Yeah, I think that. Yeah, right. Like it's
Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense for what it is, right?
Sorry, I hope that didn't come. That was a loud salter that just came by back here.
Oh, I did not even hear it, so no.
Okay, no, that's good. Well, it's been snowing for 4 hours. I guess this city had to start doing something eventually.
Yeah, exactly, right?
Speaking of that.
Yeah. Let's see here. Do we have some other examples? Do you want to talk about like sanctions or trade treaties? One of those?
Yeah, or I was
kind
thinking even like
similar, but
you have something like the military-industrial complex too, where it's
sure,
like it provides a lot of jobs.
Yep.
But it's also feeding into conflicts as well, because it needs conflicts to survive.
Yeah.
In this weird sense, yeah. Like, and even if there isn't a war, like you could still have, like, at least nowadays, because it's like, well, there's still the need, right? Because of like, in terms of like supplies, like things like boots and like gloves and like just gear in general. It's like, okay, well, you're still going to be training somebody, even if they're not at war. So you have to have all these materials provided to you. Someone's got to be making them, and it's got to be military grade, so it has to be privately contracted, like at a certain standard.
Yep.
So
yeah. So
there's two, like it's two. It's like the whole thing. It's like, I guess it's more of a defensive stance, but it's an overly aggressive, like realistic defensive stance, or like realist defensive stance, where it's like, oh, I'll just stockpile all this stuff just in
the
case.
Defensive realism stance of it is really this idea that you want to have a strong military so that if war were to ever break out against you, you could stand up for yourself, or just the sheer might of your army would be enough of a deterrence that no one would ever declare war on you, right? But then to your other point, it's the offensive realist standpoint where it says we create an industry around war. Therefore, in order to kind of justify that industry, we have to have wars that kind of go with it.
Yeah,
so it's
even
like,
if they're not the ones fighting them per se, as long as they're the ones supplying it.
Yeah. Or even just I guess the other side of that is like, which is more of like a, not even a nuanced version of like a offensive realist, but it would just be the idea of that, hey, there's 190 whatever countries in the world.
Yeah.
There's probably a bunch of them that don't really like us. There's probably a bunch of them that might try to take advantage of us. So we're going to build a big army so that we can have control over all of those countries. And anyone who stands in our way kind of is going to deal with our army to kind of be that offensive realist in that sense. Is really about taking the fight to any potential threat so that there is no threats. Because when there is no threats, you ultimately have all the power and all the control, right? Um, and that would be kind of the other side of the coin, right? Like, so I feel like the defensive realist is kind of the optimistic version of political realism in some ways.
What's the saying? Like, prepare for the best, or sorry, prepare for the worst and hope for the best kind of attitude, I guess.
Yeah.
Out of the two
Yeah.
of them, yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Prepare for the worst, hope for the best is the, yeah, you had it right there.
Yeah.
But yeah, that I think, yeah, it is very much so as optimistic as you could extrapolate from something like that.
Yeah,
right?
actually, you know what? Another thing I was thinking too is because this is one that I think you and I have talked about, but not in relation to this.
Okay.
But the SETI project,
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
right? We've sunk in billions of dollars into this thing since the 70s. We've built radio
I was going to say
telescopes all over the world.
you can't just throw that out there and not explain that for listeners.
Oh,
Because
search for extra and the search SETI is search for extraterrestrial intelligence. So it's a multinationally funded thing to look for life on other planets using radio
yeah,
telescopes. And I don't know if most people our age will probably remember James Bond GoldenEye. But that very last end of that movie, that's the radio dish in Puerto Rico. It's actually gone now. It got wiped out in the last hurricane. But
oh really?
that was, yeah. That was up until the Chinese built the other one in China now. It was the biggest one on Earth. But those are used to listen for radio signals from ET, basically. And it's the idea that, okay, like they've been sinking money into it for 40 years now. And it's like, okay, so how do we know this is working? Like, the idea is great, but how do we know that ET's using radio wave frequencies on the same frequency as us? Like, what if they're on a bandwidth we can't even pick up yet?
Yeah. Well, I also think like because obviously asking whether or not something works or whatnot is hard to, like, I feel like that's almost a different conversation in itself.
Yeah.
But specifically, if you were going to take something like that as an example, asking yourself kind of the motivation behind why do we do that, right?
Yeah.
You could say from a political realist standpoint, we do that because if there are extraterrestrial threats, right?
Yeah.
I think that's a huge part of it. You can make the argument that if there isn't even a threat, just the idea of like wanting to know if there's life outside of our planet type of thing, there may be the realist standpoint of like that will change the mentalities of people on this planet, right? And then you could also make the argument around, well, like that's an industry in itself, like a business industry, right? Like, so there's a lot of money in that, right? Case in point of the billions of dollars that you mentioned, right? Like, people make money off of that. I don't think that that's like a negative technology or anything like that, but the reality is keeping that going and starting it up even in the first place. A lot of people had to get paid to get that ball rolling, right? And to keep it rolling. And so there is an innate incentive behind anyone who's in that industry to want that to keep going. Kind of very similar to your military industrial complex one, right?
Yeah.
Right. Like the intentions in its essence can be good, or for the greater good, right? But it's the aspect of to keep things going. There's going to be a lot of players within that are also going to say, hey, I have something to gain here. I have a lot of power or stuff invested in this industry or this job surviving, right?
Or continuing to be funded the way it's being funded, in a sense.
Yeah. Right. I definitely think that that's even something as kind of maybe obscure or random as the study project is important to still have those kind of thought processes around what's our motivation for doing this, right?
Doing
Because a
things,
lot of
yeah.
things can be very easy to kind of fall under that surface
Yeah.
value, right? Um,
And not to say the study project is
yeah,
like beholden to anything malicious or anything in that sense, but
no,
it's one of the,
not at
it's
all.
one of those things that it comes from a place of good natured spirit. But again, how
Yeah,
much money can you sink in when, there's still people struggling here?
yeah, because I feel like that's almost a
The
great
big,
way to kind of look at it, where it's like
yeah,
if we spend all that money on something that ultimately, even if we found life outside of our like Earth, unless they're like right on our doorstep, so to speak, it's not making any difference in our lives, right?
lives,
As
yeah,
opposed to there's a lot of people struggling, or there's a lot of uh, needs that require resources and capital to be kind of uh, diverted to them. Um,
to allow people to
that
continue
we're
with their
that we're
lives,
not
yeah,
bothering to do,
yeah,
right? Um, I think another kind of good one, um, that's even kind of connected with the whole like uh, surface level viewing it as one way is foreign aid, right?
okay, yeah,
Uh,
that's another one,
um,
yeah,
Foreign aid obviously super important. A lot of countries like really desperately survive off of foreign aid. Um, from a humanitarian standpoint,
yeah,
it's hard to argue against foreign aid,
yeah.
right? Because
Places like Somalia and stuff that, a lot of people would starve without it in certain
yeah,
places, yeah,
right, yeah, uh, yeah. Whether it's like money, like financial foreign aid, or like actual like kind of food and supplies, like medical supplies, like all those
yeah,
types of things. Um, but I guess there's also the aspect of like foreign aid can be a lot of different things, right? Like you could make the argument that the situation in Ukraine, the military foreign aid, right, is also kind of connected with foreign aid.
foreign aid, yeah.
Um, but even if you want to just stick away from the military stuff and just look at it from like the hey,
Just the
we're giving
humanitarian
food, right?
aspect,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, the
exactly,
humanitarian stuff. Um, a lot of foreign aid comes with a lot of stipulations,
yeah,
and those stipulations um oftentimes allow the kind of countries who are giving that foreign aid to eventually control those countries,
yeah,
right? um Maybe they're controlling who's in power, or they're kind of getting control through gaining access of that country,
yeah,
um to kind of foreign businesses to come and invest in there or whatever, right? Like there's a lot of um, even stipulations on if it's like
incentive,
money type
yeah,
of thing, like what you can invest that money in,
money in, yeah.
right? Um,
You got to put it into like, well, you would say schools or something like that, hopefully, right? So some countries, obviously, they'll tell them to invest it into defense or something like that if they have more concerns about
yeah,
their own security than they
yeah.
do of the country they're helping in that situation.
Well, I feel like that's almost an interesting point in the fact that like there's no stipulations put on
Correct.
the foreign aid, and then it goes to a country who is desperately in need of it, but the people in power kind of take that money and divert it to their own personal needs, right? Whether
Needs,
it's building up
yeah.
their own personal like military or wealth, like just in general, right?
Correct, yeah.
Um, I'm
Exploiting
not saying that
mines or
happens all
something
the
like that.
time, but
No, no, it does happen though.
yeah, yeah, right. Like so, I feel like any of those kind of decisions, right? Um, especially in our kind of democratic world, um, it's so important to be aware of this realist perspective within politics,
Yeah,
which
in
is
the sense of,
arguably the dominant perspective.
yeah, being used to
Um,
consolidate political power, right?
yeah,
In that
right. Like
sense,
the
yeah.
and recognizing that they're is normally a lot of good that does come
Good,
with some of the
yes.
negative, right? Like it's not
Yeah.
that it's all there's no value in any decision, right?
No, we've had a
Um,
lot of, I guess, what's the word? Like advancements come out of stuff like that, right? Where it's ends up benefiting everybody as a whole in the long run.
100%, yeah, or benefiting enough people, right?
People, correct? Yes,
Um,
yeah.
but sometimes there's unforeseen consequences or potentially um,
Just setbacks or
maybe
drawbacks. Yeah,
yeah, or certain benefits that we didn't necessarily want to have happen. And I know a benefit is automatically seen as a positive, but if I gain extra wealth from a certain decision,
yeah,
I may have benefited, but is that really the like kind of ultimate goal
yeah.
of a lot of decisions, especially decisions that come with governments, right? Like I think Jordan and I would both make the argument that if a government is making a decision, that decision should be helping the
The vast
vast
majority.
majority of
Yeah,
people, and in particularly it should be benefiting the least, like the most disadvantaged people of our society, right?
yeah.
Because the goal is to kind of uplift the lower half to be able to kind of, because it also benefits the upper half, if you want to call it like that,
Yes,
right? Like
yeah.
um so
Who are
yeah, like
maybe in
I've
a position enough for the benefits aren't even necessary for them, could be wasted on them in a sense.
yeah, right. And like kind of a case in point, you're spending all that money when you could be spending all that money and resources in another place,
Somewhere
right?
else, yeah.
Yeah. Or certain people are gaining votes and getting into power, but that one decision is not reflective of every decision that person will ever have to
Would
make.
have to make, or it might not even
Right?
be reflective of like the pressing issues at hand.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? Is some
Like
because sometimes like, and it's like to your point too, like people don't, if they're distracted well enough, right? And then it's you forget about, like, you're thinking people get fired up certain things and it kind of distracts you from the bigger picture. Sometimes we're all guilty of it,
yeah.
right?
Yeah,
And
100%.
sometimes people use that to play and gain power for themselves and take more, like to take more power for themselves and take more advantage, or sometimes
Yeah.
it just is a byproduct of them trying to do something right.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I think that that's 100% true. Um and you can make the argument that that's just true in general with politics, right? It's not even like
Yeah,
a
it's more
political
of a that's a
realist
broad
conversation,
stroke
but
statement. Yeah,
yeah, yeah. Um, but it definitely comes out a lot more, I think, because of this philosophy of political realism,
realism. Yeah,
right? Rather than a purely idealistic view on how you're going to go about
about it.
things.
Yeah,
And that's not to say, like, we're not talking about idealism right now, but Jordan and I could easily go down the list, and I think most people could go down the list and say the negatives of just having a purely idealistic
ideal
view.
mindset. Yes,
Yeah, right.
which of
That's
course, because like I would say like I like to think ideally from time to time, like and same thing for
yeah,
you. But it's yeah, it's like anything. It can get um moderation is key, basically.
yeah, and I think not to heavily go into this, but the whole essence of what our channel is, right? Like the when my thought process around the idea of like the realist idealists was that you are at your core an idealist, that everything in life you are an idealist, but you are going to be as realist and realistic as
As
possible
possible,
with
correct.
those idealist views. So
But
it's
then
always, how can I be as real with my reality but move as close to an idealistic utopian oriented mindset, right? Like how do I see the
overall,
best in the world, or bring
yeah,
myself to get to the best of the world, but being fair with my kind of situation, right?
yeah,
The idea that like, oh, you never need a military, right? Like anyone who says like, or like completely defund the police, right? like,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
completely get rid of the military. Well, that's just not logical, right? Because like, as much as I would love to live in a world where there is no war, there is no crime, there is no whatever,
There's still going to be natural disasters. Yeah.
things are going to happen. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, whether it be natural disaster wise or just someone's going to try to take advantage of a situation,
Yeah.
right? And
There's
that's
always going to be someone that's maybe mentally a little bit unstable and slips
sure,
through like the
yeah,
cracks of society,
yeah,
right? So like
yeah.
it's
There's
even
always
if
going to be
we
a
make it a
reason.
perfect world, it's not life's never going to be perfect.
Yes, yeah. A perfect world in reality is not this idea of like
Yeah.
everyone's tranquil type of thing, right?
Because I can't remember, like I was make that statement. I'm like, even if we fix every problem we have here tomorrow morning, there's still a big angry universe, an unpredictable universe. I shouldn't say angry, but unpredictable universe out there.
A chaotic, yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, yeah. Chaos will come, but yeah, I think because we're probably getting close to wrapping things up here. Ultimately, I think the real important things to remember with this idea of political realism being a part of our or realism being a part of our politics,
Yeah.
is that there are obviously pros and cons with things, but and you have to really look at kind of who benefits from them. But in particular, there's also the kind of the question of, okay, here's what we resulted in, but what could have been had we not taken those political realist standpoints, right? Like, so decisions that should be made or may not be made, maybe more defined by the power that was gained from them, right? And if that power is in place for long enough and you can build up enough power, right? The way that our world works, if you have too much power, right? We've talked about this before.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You ultimately kind of erode any sense of really, I would make the argument of progress, right?
Yes.
That you, because you just can't have, like, it would just be one person's decision, right? Or one
All
group's
the time.
decision.
Yes. Yeah. And that
Right.
eventually bottlenecks and
yeah.
everything. Right. So
yeah, even there, you can always have too much of a good thing, right? Like,
yes.
like
Yes.
it's that mentality.
Yeah. Well, and that's like if you have like a dictator, like eventually, if he's the only one making decisions, right? And the people who are in charge of bringing him information are afraid for their lives,
Yeah.
might not then in turn direct all the correct information to that person.
Definitely.
Right. So then it starts to break down whether you notice it or not.
And it's funny you said that, because you and I are big Star Wars fans, right?
Yes.
And we've obviously we're recording this episode more recent relative to maybe some of the episodes. So right now, to name drop a little here, but or not name drop, but Bad Batch season 2 is on Disney right now, and you're really seeing in the kind of Galactic Empire's political system this idea that you really want to hide certain information, so that you can kind of continue to rise to the top, right? You don't want any bad information getting relayed.
Correct.
It's just like, hey, everything's good, everything's fine, don't worry, don't look over there.
Palpatine is
right?
the ultimate neo-realist. Everything is consolidating more power for himself.
Right. It's a full-blown political realism in a government, right? Like, so that I feel like is exactly what the point you just made, but more in a fictional sense. But if you watch that, you'll get the idea of what political realism is all about. But yeah, and just this idea that kind of it connected with that is that decisions to maybe help, right, like a certain group or someone like that may not happen, right? And we've not necessarily talked about it a lot yet, but I know, kind of because we've already recorded a handful of episodes that will be released after this, right?
Yeah.
Certain interventions helping one country versus another a lot of times come back down to, is that country valuable that you're going to help, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is there something,
strategically,
strategic value within that nation? And if there isn't, a lot of times you'll see that kind of horrible things just continue to happen, right? And that's directly connected to a political realist philosophy, right? At the end of the day, good or bad, that is ultimately
the result.
The result. But yeah, I think that's probably a good place to end it there. What do you think?
Yes, sir. Yeah. Without getting lost in too many more examples and drawing too much more politics into it. Yes.
Yeah. As you can tell, like even just from us trying to do the examples, it instantly would spiral to something else.
Yeah. We could leave on the note that if you guys need a real world example, think of a few vice presidents ago with many chins.
Yeah.
Christian Bale did him great.
Yes. Yeah. Go watch the movie Vice.
Yes. Yeah. It's really good. Might take your advice.
Yeah. There you go. Well, thank you all for listening. Hopefully you learned something, right? And gotten a bit of an idea of what political realism is and kind of the importance of actually really knowing
how it's applied in political.
Yeah, how it's applied. Exactly.
Atmosphere. Yeah.
And whether you consider yourselves more of a realist or anything like that or not, just reminding yourself that whenever you're personally making a decision or you are observing another decision, really asking kind of yourself, why is that decision being made the way that's being made? But I think on that note, I'm Braden. He's Jordan. We are the Realist Idealists, and this is Powerview.